Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey, what's everybody? It's Scott Groves here with the On the Edge podcast. I'm here with my new friend, Les Leslie, who owns Gringo Strategic. I love the name. He's going to tell you what that means. We got introduced by another freedom-loving friend of ours, Laura DiBenedetto, who owns Sovereign Ammunition out in Florida. So, Les, I don't know a whole lot about you other than Laura said that we have to talk, and any friend of Laura's a friend of mine. So, first of all, tell us where this call finds you, and then tell us what Gringo Strategic is.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Where I am? Well, I am in BFE, Virginia, at the current time, overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, and about to get on the road for a training event tomorrow. So as soon as we wrap this, I'm going to throw some crap in a bag and get on the road dark and early in the AM.
Nice.
So yeah, Gringo Strategic is I call it a for-profit think tank, which essentially is a consultancy. But we specialize in self-preservation training. And we have a goal eventually of, developing decentralized networked communities around the country that are self-sufficient and able to pull themselves away from all the economics and supply chain issues that we're all experiencing everywhere right now. So our entry point with self-preservation is actually gun training, and one of the reasons for that is that if you can't defend it, you don't own it. And so, yeah, if you're going to be self-sufficient, if you're going to, shorten your supply chain, if you're going to be in a situation where you're not dependent on what appears to be a horribly failing system, and things do actually descend to a point where there's civil unrest and some folks without are going in search of, and you happen to be the guy with, well, then it could well come to a situation where you have to actually defend what it is that you worked for and grown. So
it's funny because I think 2 years ago, if somebody hears the word self-preservation, gun training, decentralized communities, controlling your own supply chain, these maybe buzzwords or terms, I think people 2 years ago are like, oh man, Les is crazy. This is some Ruby Ridge, Idaho militia, crazy people that want to secede from the government. And, I don't have any problems. Kroger's, Ralph's, Whole Foods, they're always full of food. And then starting 2 years ago, we start to see the pandemic and we start to see overnight there's a run on toilet paper, right? And I remember one of my friends being like, hey man, I always thought you were kind of crazy for having a couple 100 gallons of water at your house and a couple days of food. But this run on toilet paper has really made me think what happens if there was a run on meat or dairy goods or canned foods? Could we really be out of this stuff? I'm like, yeah, at the time I was living in Los Angeles. Now we spend most of our time up at our second home in Las Vegas. And I was like, yeah, Las Vegas as a valley or Los Angeles as a valley, there's about 5 days of supplies in that valley if the trucking routes shut down. And we've now just been through this social experiment where the government has proved they can pretty much shut down whatever they want, whether it's for nefarious reasons or just they don't know what they're getting into. And then, we start to have mostly peaceful protests during the day that turns into bedlam at night and, burning down half the city. And then you're seeing people get pulled out of their cars in downtown LA or out on the freeway in Minneapolis. And it's I think people are aware of it's not just the crazy militia people that want to secede from the union that are maybe want to be self-prepared. So can you tell us a little bit, how has that mentality changed with the people you're training where, the stereotype probably the redneck in Alabama or the militia guy in Idaho is the only one that would take this training. And now it's probably a lot of people that live in the city that's maybe I need to be a little bit more self-sufficient based on what I've observed.
Yeah, well, and so that's a fair question. I'm not a militia member. That's really not what I do. And I'm not a secessionist, to be fair. I'm a radically traditional American.
Yep.
I'll wear that label all day long. But I'm not looking for a fight, man. I'm really not. I'm a guy who likes to be left alone. I keep to myself quite a little bit. and I just I see problems, right? Um, and I've positioned myself geographically to where, you know, if things descend into chaos, or you know what we saw a couple of years ago, after George Floyd, or during COVID, or what have you, I'm pretty insulated from that, and I like that, and I want to share it with other people, because I think it's important. You know, again, your point about Kroger, for example, right? Okay, you got one of two situations, right? The trucks aren't arriving, the store shelves aren't stocked, and or prices are rising to a point where it starts to be cost prohibitive to buy stuff at Kroger. Okay, fine. So how do you deal with that? Well, you start taking links out of your supply chain. You know, maybe that means you grow tomatoes, you know, in the backyard or on your deck. Um, but you're right. I mean, the perception is changing, and people are very, very on edge. And I mean, they're scared, they're frightened, they don't know what's coming around the corner, and those are all understandable emotions given what we're seeing in the news cycle, and you know, not just here but internationally. Um, so yeah, I mean, I have an awful lot more requests and conversations with folks all over the country, from urban to rural. Um, you know, I do a fair amount of work up and down the East Coast here. I do a fair amount of work in the Midwest, and I mean, my calendar's full, man. And you know, it's not crazies, you know, that are training.
Right.
And I mean, what we do isn't confined to gun training either. I mean, that's just an entry point, because you know that skill set is important enough, and it's complex enough to where I feel like that's the thing that we should train first, because it's the hardest thing to learn to do well,
Right.
of the things that I teach. Um, so, you know, with that in mind, again, it's not, you know, I mean, yeah, I have housewives, I have businessmen, you know, yeah, I've got farmers, I got ranchers, I've got, you know, all kinds of folks. In fact, I've had some very, very interesting conversations over the course of the last 2, 3 weeks, with various folks in Europe, who are wanting to do something similar, in terms of, you know, end state concept. And you know, they've come to the conclusion that, you know, holy cow, that's where you know, Gringo Strategic's going, that's where we're going, but there's a hole in our plan. And the hole in their plan is they don't know how to deal with violence. You know, and some of that is just cultural and legal in Europe. You know, we obviously have a different attitude about guns here in the States, and you know, self-defense generally. But you know, that's just, you know, like I say, I when I got into this, I never expected to be having the substantive calls that I've had with folks out of Europe. Never even occurred to me.
Amazing. And tell us a little bit about your background. Like, what makes you, one, qualified to talk about this stuff, teach this stuff, and two, the desire to do it, right? Because I would think most people that kind of want to be left alone and want to have their little supply and their own chicken coop and their, you know, their own stuff also really want to be left alone, right? Don't want to talk to other
Yeah.
people about it. So what is your background? I know it's military a bit, but what's your background that got you to this point?
Yeah, so I grew up in the northern Midwest. Joined the army out of college. Hated college and dropped out. Decided I'd fall out of airplanes instead. So I did that, and got out. Started running some of my own businesses. I got out of the army in Alaska, and one of the I was running a screen print shop at the time. I was a vet making T-shirts before being a vet making T-shirts was cool.
Right.
Um, and uh, and I got a call one day from a buddy of mine, and he says, "Hey, man," he says, "you can shoot, right?" Yeah, I can shoot. And he says, "Well," he says, "have you ever climbed any glaciers?" I'm like, "Yeah, I have. You know, climbed Volcanic, climbed Spencer, you know, traversed the Harding ice fields. I've been around a little bit." He's, "All right, cool, man." He said, "Look," he said, "I got one more question for you." He said, "Doesn't matter what the answer is." He says, "It's not a deal breaker." He said, "But you don't speak Japanese, do you?" I said, yeah, I do speak Japanese. He says, what? I said, you asked if I spoke Japanese. I said, yeah, I speak Japanese. Why? What are you asking me about? And he's like, well, the Geophysical Institute at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, he said, they've got all these Japanese research scientists that are coming in and out of there, and they work for the Japanese government, but they go out in the bush, and the government doesn't want them being eaten by bears. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. They're probably high priced guys, right?
Right.
um, so I ended up contracting to the Japanese government for a couple of years, just wandering around on glaciers, a few days a week, every other week, keeping a couple of Japanese research biologists alive and not being eaten by bears. And so, that kind of started my protective career after the Army, right? And kind of my wilderness survival streak, and just being in odd environments. And I read a lot of things. I've been a lifelong outdoorsman. I was very, very fortunate to grow up with an old man who taught me an awful lot about pretty much everything worth knowing is how I frame it. And at a certain point in my career, I started working for distributed security, and I was the business development guy. And what we were doing at distributed security was really high end gun training for enterprises and individuals, and defending enterprises and doing that kind of thing. And
when you say defending enterprises, is this like private security that'll guard the Google Cloud storage facility that's up the street from us?
No,
or is this
it could be that, but it's a little different model.
Okay.
The model at DSI is in-house proprietary security. So, typically the enterprise will identify a small cadre of employees that we would train to respond to a violent event. And so as a result, we did that for churches, we did it for schools as well. So it's very efficient, very cost effective security plan for enterprises, churches, and schools.
Interesting.
And so, yeah. So as a result, I've been in this world in one way or another for a very, very long time. And building community and leadership and stuff, of course, goes back to Army and working with foreign forces and doing a lot of different other things. But as to why do it, right? Again, I tag myself as a radically traditional American, right? And what does that mean to me? Well, look, I'm not a big fan of our current government, but I really love my people. And I want to see people prosper, and I want to see them succeed. And I would really love to see this whole thing, revert to core principles, and those core principles are what's in the Declaration, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit. I typically throw a tagline on stuff: life, liberty, and property. But I guess here's the thing, right? If you have a right to life, liberty, and property, then you also have a right to defend those things, right?
Right.
That they go hand in hand. Having something doesn't do you much good if you don't have any ability
Your
or
mic is
right
on.
to defend it. That's not ownership.
Right.
And so, it goes deeper than the Declaration. Where did that come from? Well, pursuit of happiness is just a euphemism for property. Jefferson got that from John Locke and the Enlightenment thinkers. They were basing that on natural law, which was all codified by St. Thomas Aquinas. And that goes back from Aquinas to Aristotle. And so these are core principles, relative to Western civilization. Western civilization doesn't exist without that concept of being, owning your life, your liberty, and your property. And so,
and by the way, isn't it crazy that we're in a current state of affairs politically, socially, media, government, that just saying that out loud in maybe for 30 or 40% of America, will make you sound radical. Like the idea that you or I would have a guiding fundamental like principle in our brain that you are due the right as an American to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is really property, like your own homestead. Like the fact that that is in some way radical or misconstrued as like right wing, or it shouldn't. That should be the basis for all political parties. It blows my mind.
But it is the basis, right? It's right there in the document, and so and I take it a step further. It's not that we have those rights as an American. It's that we have those rights as human beings. Those are human rights. They're natural rights. And so yeah, all right, I get it. I mean, there's governments out there that haven't legally recognized that, but it doesn't change the reality. And so if you want to make the case that all people are equal and all people are entitled to the same things on the basis that they're human, well, hey, there's a good place to start.
Yeah.
And it's not like it's a foreign concept. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. It's absolutely bananas that we have to defend, that line of thought, particularly as Americans, but as students of history, as just rational, compassionate human beings, why should we have to defend that? I refuse to defend it.
Yeah.
And I just do it. Fine. If people have a problem with that, okay, you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But here we are. So yeah, it's goofy, man. We what a time to be alive, right?
What a time. But I'm sure every generation, and I'm guessing you're 2 or 3 years older than me.
I'm 52.
52. Okay, so you're 8 years older than me. So okay. It's like by the time you start to get more gray hair than black hair, I feel like probably every generation has gone through this where it's like the world is ending, get off my grass, these crazy kids, these crazy politics. Yeah. Like I still do have faith in the institution of America, and even though our politicians really feel to be letting us down right now, I'm hoping there's a new crop of specifically ex-military politicians that have like kind of been called to service. A bunch come to mind, but I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic, but I also don't mind being prepared, which is where your company comes in, right? And right. Unfortunately, due to a couple of the Discovery Channel shows on preppers that made that kind of prepping community look like a bunch of morons, I've got a buddy similar to you who's like, I'm trying to redefine this as like, hey, our company is about being prepared, not being this crazy prepper. And so right. let me tell you what I think kind of the 3 levels of preparedness are based on kind of what I've seen out there. There's level 1 where it's like, the last couple of years kind of freaked me out. I'm going to maybe have a gun in a safe box. I'm going to pick up a couple extra canned goods every time I go to the store. Maybe I'll have a closet that's full of water bottles and toilet paper and whatnot. And, I'll be okay for a couple of days. It won't be so comfortable, but I'll be okay if there's some civil unrest or there's an earthquake in LA or there's a flash flood in Vegas or whatever, So it's like, I've got some supplies, right? And then I kind of feel like that level 2 person is like, well, I'm kind of stuck where I'm stuck. I live in suburbia. I'm in a track house, but, I've got a garage full of stuff. I've got some solar panels and maybe a generator, and I've got a month's worth of food. And like, there can be a major earthquake, and in the month or two it takes FEMA to get into the county and like mobilize, kind of like what we saw after Hurricane Katrina. Like, if it's really a shit show for a month, I'm going to be okay, and at least my family will survive. Won't be comfortable, won't have high-speed internet, but we'll be okay. And then that level 3, and I've got a lot of friends like this that are moving an hour or two outside of Austin, Texas. It's like, no, I'm going to have a ranch. I am going to have 1,000 gallons of fuel and my own chicken coop and my own, pickled foods and canned goods and several guns and a community of people that we're going to support each other if the shit really hits the fan. And we're strategically moving far enough away from city epicenters where that first couple waves of protesters will peter out. And I'm basically going to be fully self-sufficient on this 4 or 5 acres I have because I have the ability and I work from home and I have the money to buy the stuff. Like maybe, first of all, critique my continuum of people that want to be prepared. And then where do you guys kind of fall in, or where do you see a lot of people that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally right. I mean, in terms of kind of a hierarchy or a tiered level of where people are in their headspace. Where we are, I guess I'd say I'm somewhere between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a Connex full of MREs out back, right? So, I mean, I'm not that guy. Um, and again, I mean, I'm not looking for a fight either.
Right.
But, if a fight happens to find me, I'm not a guy who walks away from a fight easy. I mean, it's not who I am. So for me and for most of the people who contract us to help them out, it's 2, it's 3, it's an odd add mixture of the two.
Yeah.
And now truly, I mean, we're starting to encroach on those folks that are at 1.
Right. So these are the people
And,
that bought the gun, put it in a lockbox, because
sure.
there was a riot down the street from their house 2 years ago, and now they're like, that's kind of silly. I don't even know how to shoot that thing particularly well. I'm gonna blow my fucking foot off if I really get into an emergency situation.
Yeah. Yeah, no. And that's not uncommon, right? There was a whole lot of people who kind of had a knee-jerk reaction, and they went and bought a piece. They didn't buy any training.
Right.
They brought it home, and what they got, without the training, was a really high-priced paperweight.
Right.
And
a potentially dangerous paperweight.
Well, sure, yeah. If they actually loaded said paperweight, right, now they're a danger to themselves and others. And they held on to the thing. They didn't take it down to the pawn shop. And now things are coming apart at the seams, right? They're watching what's happening. They're their monthly expenses are going up, whether it's electricity, whether it's food, whether it's gas, whether it's whatever it is, rent. And they're seeing the unrest. They're seeing the politicians not being the solution. They're seeing Europe go bananas.
Yeah, and for those that aren't keeping finish your thought and then we'll come back to Europe.
Yeah, and so I mean, they're just they're being pushed to a point where they're edgy enough to where they're starting to think, okay, well, I was gonna get off, I was gonna unask this gun thing when the riots stopped, but I still got it around, and I'm starting to think I may still need it. Maybe I ought to figure out which end's the business end, right? And so yeah, I mean, there are fewer and fewer people, I think, in that tier 1 pool that we were just talking about, right? The guys are like, yeah, okay, I got a little bottle of water, I'm good. But yeah, I mean, I think we're largely past that, and a lot of people aren't saying it out loud necessarily. They may not be flying their freak flag on social media about it. But in private, with people they trust, they're having adult conversations about this.
Yeah, I will tell you, and I would never out them on YouTube or a podcast or publicly, but in the summer of 2020, so when stuff was getting pretty crazy, I had 3 different realtors who I work with. 2 were women, one's a male, and I would say they're pretty left of center. Probably voted for Gavin Newsom 3 times. Kind of call me on the slide and be like, "Hey, Scott, you might be the only Republican that I know." I'm like, well, first of all, I'm a libertarian, not a Republican. I didn't actually vote for Trump or Clinton. I voted for the third party because I'm kind of voting my conscience. But okay, next conversation. They're like, yeah, but you used to be in the Army, and I know you have guns. Could you teach me how to shoot? No, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. We can't post anything on social media. I don't want anybody to know that I held a gun. By the way, my husband bought a gun, but don't tell anybody. I need to learn from somebody other than my husband how to shoot a gun, because like now it's in our house, and so it's like, we went to the range and we went through gun safety, and we talked about like, hey, this is why you keep it locked up. You're not going to be Chuck Norris pulling it out in the middle of a home invasion. You want to have the gun for something that you can see coming like 15 minutes or 15 hours away. You're not going to be, a Liam Neeson and take on like busting people out. Like just keep it in a safe so your kid can never find it. And so we had all these gun safety conversations. Then we went shooting, and they loved it. And even after they loved it, they were like, "Don't put anything on social media. Don't tell anybody that we ever shot a gun." And I know that those people, maybe they're watching. They've got a lot of supplies at home that they probably don't admit to their friends, and I think that's hilarious because their friends probably also have the same supplies, but they're embarrassed to mention it.
Yeah, and I mean, to me that goes hand in hand with what I'll call self-censorship, right? Everybody is so hypersensitive to saying something that's going to get them canceled or get them fired or what have you, right? That, even when people aren't being, actively censored by some second or third party, they're doing it to themselves.
Right.
And it's really, it's inhibiting communication. It's inhibiting, you know, real conversation about the problems, the challenges, and potential solutions.
Yeah.
And I think that's tragic, right? Particularly in a country where not only do you have a Second Amendment, okay, but you got a First Amendment, right?
Right.
You have a protected right to political speech and free speech. And okay, what is the problem, right? How is what somebody says or is concerned about fodder for removing them from their livelihood,
Right.
right? It's the most ridiculous, stupid ass thing I've ever seen. And I mean, it's very, very Soviet,
Yeah.
if we want to be honest about it. Um, and look, you're old enough. You probably didn't come into the Army during the Cold War. The Cold War was probably just recently over when
Yeah,
you
I
hit the
joined. I
Army.
joined in '97. So yeah,
Yeah,
it was the
yeah,
Berlin Wall had fallen.
yeah.
Obviously in the '80s, and then kind of what's his name? Oh Jesus, second president of Russia was already in office. Like it was pretty. The Cold War was
You're
pretty
talking
much
about,
over.
yeah,
It was a
yeah.
very quiet.
Yeltsin was in,
Yeah, Yeltsin was
and
in.
it was, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's I mean, I'm a product of the Cold War, and I joined the Army during the Cold War. And so, I remember that being that being the big red threat, right? That was the thing everybody was focused on. I remember Reagan being elected. I remember, those 8 years very, very clearly. Um, well, in fact, when the wall came down, I was in Germany. I was there. Um, so yeah, I mean, that those were all formative experiences for me, and now, in retrospect, now that I'm the old guy, right, I'm I'm looking back at this and I'm like, wait, all this crap that was bad when I was a kid growing up, now all of a sudden we've imported and is manifested here.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden it's good. No, man, that's not right. This is nonsense, right?
Right.
This all this stuff is very, very, characteristically what would have been Soviet 40 years ago.
Right.
And that's, the whole world's upside down, right? Nothing looks right anymore.
Right. Right.
So
And what's interesting is, and I don't care if you're on the left and the right, everybody politically, personally, we all have our blind spots. But at some point, you have to look at things and be like, how do supposedly the smartest minds in the world at the Federal Reserve, at the federal government, at these banking institutions, how do they decide through COVID, like, what we need to do? We need to print somewhere between $2 trillion and $5 trillion, but don't worry, it's not going to cause inflation. Like, I barely made it through 11th grade. Like, my mom had to beg the high school district to let me graduate because I had 55 absences my senior years. I got decent at wrestling, I discovered surfing, and I really discovered girls my senior year of high school. So I had way too many absences. They were going to fail me. I barely made it through 11th grade. And, like, as they're spending all this money, I'm like, inflation, like, is defined in Thomas Sowell's book, Basic Economics, as too many dollars chasing too few goods. And I'm like, well, we're not making any goods because we made everybody shut down, but we've got all this money coming to the system. Well, I don't know. These people are way smarter than me. They had to have figured this out. And then now they're like 2 years later, well, it looks like maybe inflation here is here to stay, and we're going to have to turn off the power in California, and most people making minimum wage can't even afford groceries anymore. I'm like, did no one smarter than me see that this is a recipe for disaster?
Yeah. Nobody saw this coming, right?
Yeah.
This was just too difficult to figure out. Are you smarter than a third grader, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, well, I guess the same thing with COVID, right? I mean, everything I needed to know about COVID, I learned in high school biology.
Right.
I knew that on the front end. But yeah, I mean, it's well, okay. So you mentioned inflation, and you mentioned, volume of dollars in the system versus, a lack of goods. That was the Soviet issue as well. Nobody was lacking for cash in the Soviet Union. What they lacked was anything to buy. That
Right.
was what caused poverty in the Soviet Union. And it's a pretty typical problem, in well, totalitarian regimes generally. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
we can go down the list. Cuba,
sure.
Venezuela, like North
Yeah.
Korea. Like, yeah, great. They can print as much money as they want, but if they
Yeah.
don't have capitalism, there's no goods to be produced to be purchased with the money.
Right. Well, and the bigger issue, right, is that a third world economy, which is, I mean, we're coming in hard and fast on that right now. A third world economy yields third world everything, right? So every other third world problem you can possibly tick off a checklist, it's coming on the backside of the economy going to crap.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just that's the way this works, and it's not like there's a lack of examples to draw on and to compare to.
Yeah.
um, I joke and I'm kind of snarky about it, but I sit back and I go, wow, if there was only just a set of principles that we could look at and understand how this all would work, if,
Right, right.
you know,
And here's the thing. Anybody that's made it this far, maybe at this point is like rolling their eyes and be like, wow, Scott's really putting on his tinfoil hat on this one. And this sounds a little conspiratorial. Because I'm trying to balance two thoughts in my mind at the same time. Thought number one is we could, no farming in Ukraine, which provides 30% of the food to Central Europe, right? Strained relations with China. Like, we could get to a point where between supply chain and inflation and kind of leftover problems from COVID, it just feels like a powder keg that's waiting for a match. That's one thought I'm keeping in my mind. And the other thought is, I can't wait to reserve my iPhone 14 tomorrow for $1,500. So clearly the supply chain ain't that broken, because I'm getting a brand new state-of-the-art camera in 6 weeks that I'm going to reserve tomorrow and gladly pay $1,400 for. So it's this weird dichotomy of like, well, we're still a first world nation. We got first world problems. I'm going to go to a comedy show tonight after, I see my kids, and like, how rich are we as a country that I can live this life of leisure and go to a comedy show after we take care of my kids' open house thing. But then on the other hand, I'm like, oh yeah, this should get ugly. Maybe I should have some more food in the pantry. It's a really weird place to be mentally without sounding like we're schizophrenic and like just some crazy conspiracy theorist.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I would say, economically, and look, I walk that line every day too, right? I mean, it's very easy for me, in part just because of my demeanor, to come off as a loon, and that's, it's not it. I consider myself to be a reasonably level-headed guy. I'm not prone to craziness. It's just not who I am. But economically, the other side of that, over and above, the supply chain issues, right? We've outsourced all the manufacturing, and that's really what's creating an awful lot of the supply chain issues. But we've offshored and outsourced manufacturing to folks that we've now essentially made, adversaries of.
Right.
And so, hey, wow, there's a built-in warfighting machine right there. Hey, just stop sending them their stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a problem.
Yeah.
But the other piece of that, on an international finance level, is the US dollar has been the reserve currency for what, 50 years,
Yeah.
right? And it's been tied to oil. Well, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, India, are all making a concerted effort right now in the BRICS bloc, to create at least a secondary, if not a different, reserve currency. And that would apply essentially to 2/3 of the world.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of what, a lot of our ability as Americans to kind of ignore, economic principles, because that's what we've been doing. A lot of our ability to do that has been tied to the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency. And every dollar spent on oil, every dollar spent, period, cycles through the states, cycles through New York. And so that's given us a lot of leverage.
Yeah.
And so it's given us the ability to do some things and to ignore some laws,
Right.
In the world that, okay, if that goes away, well, a lot of that leverage goes away as well.
Yeah.
And so, there's layers upon layers, to this whole thing, if you really want to chase down that rabbit trail.
Yeah.
But, so
Somebody gave me a great analogy on the world, on the U.S. dollar being a reserve currency, and this isn't completely analogous, but it was good enough. It's like the U.S. was an up and coming teenager, and then we were a badass college student, and then as a college student, we found out that Daddy had a trust fund for us. So in our 20s and 30s and 40s and now into our 50s, we're spending way more money than we make because we've got Daddy's trust fund, and we're still kind of thinking about our glory days back in college when we were like hard working and hard charging. But what we don't want to admit to ourselves is that in our 50s, Dad's going to die and the trust fund's going to run out, right? And it's like at that moment that Dad dies and the trust fund's gone, we're screwed. And that's kind of the analogy to once the world decides, oh, you cut off Russia with economic sanctions, China owns too much of your debt. You guys, we don't really like how you play with the rest of the world for whatever reason, economic, societally, governmental. If they just decide the US dollar is not the world reserve currency anymore, which cannot really happen overnight, it's kind of a long, slow decline. We're in real trouble.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good analogy, but there are historic examples that essentially are timeline specific, right? So we've been here what 2.5 centuries, right? Well, who was on top before us? Well,
The Brits, the Dutch
the
before
Brits,
that,
right? Exactly. And so how long was the British Empire? About 250 years. How long were the Dutch on top? About 250 years, right? So there's a precedent here.
Yep.
And that's not to say that means we're doomed and that everything lasts 250 years.
Right.
But there is a cycle there that if you're not cognizant of it, there's kind of a natural ebb and flow to this thing, I think. And those examples kind of bear that out. Yes, do I think that you could extend that longevity? Yeah, I think you could, but you've got to be aware of that and prepare to do that. You have to make a conscientious effort not to do stupid things that leads directly to that result on that timeline.
Right.
And
right.
I don't know that we've done that well.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I could talk politics all day long with you, I feel. So you're going to have to come out to Vegas or LA at some point so we can have a beer and a cigar, and we'll turn this into a 5-hour conversation. But I want to get a little bit back to Gringo Strategic. So, when I think of gun training, I think of the gun training I can provide somebody is like general safety, the 4 basic safety laws of a gun, which ends the business end, how to hit a target more or less, how to hold the gun, how to basically operate safely, right? And then I feel it moves on from there to like, oh, you can actually be an accurate shooter. You have a little bit of like tactical awareness. And then this is always my favorite drill. I was working with a gun range instructor, and he's like, yeah, every time one of these guys thinks they're super hot shit and they come out here with all the tactical gear and they're usually overweight because they're military guys that are past their prime, I'm like, hey, do me a favor. Either run up the hill and back or do 20 burpees and then try to draw your gun, cock your gun, and shoot a target without blowing your foot off. And you get somebody doing 20 burpees and their heart rate goes through the roof, and then they try to unholster their weapon, maybe cock it or put a magazine in it, do a reload, and try to shoot a target. They become like a bumbling idiot when their heart rate's up, which is exactly what's going to happen if you're in a real emergency situation. And then from there, it just gets more and more tactical, shooting at night, shooting 2-gun, 3-gun, stuff like that. So for people that might be interested, either because they're layman's or they're like, hey, what is the evolution of gun training? Can you talk about what you guys train and kind of what those, what those stages are?
Yeah. So our fundamental course is 2 days long, 8 hours a day on the range. But we start, with 17 fundamental things, right? We do go over, the 4 fundamental firearm safety habits. But draw, stance, all the grip, draw, stance, it just goes through it's a word I'm looking here for.
Evolution.
Okay, an evolution. I'll take that one. That's not exactly what I have, but get close. But so we do that portion a little differently. I do have a background in Japanese martial arts, and I'm very, very conscious of the ergonomics and the biomechanics of movement, right? And so I take a lot of time to make sure that people are doing things in the most physically efficient way, because to do them physically efficient is A, easier on the body, and B, quicker, right? And in a gunfight, quick matters. Um, so we go through that stuff, we dial all that stuff in. Um, we dial all that in with some dry practice on the front end, and then we start sending rounds downrange. There's no classroom time. There's no death by PowerPoint. That's not how I work. There's very, very little value in buying firearms training and then watching slides.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I can watch slides all day long on shooting a free throw until I get out to the basketball court. I got you can't explain that on paper.
Yeah. Gun training is a doing thing, right? Yeah. It's not a talking thing. And so, we'll go through a progression, which is the word I was looking for a minute ago. On the firing side, very, very slow, very deliberate, very mechanical at first, just amping up the heat a little bit, amping up the speed. We're not training for competition shooting.
Right.
So, we're looking for, round placement inside a hand's width, because you're talking about a gunfight, and combatives are different than competition. I'm not looking for a 10 ring shot. I'm looking for thoracic cavity, ocular cranial. That's what I'm looking for, because this is a life-saving skill, right? I mean, it's not a show. It's not a competition. This is holy crap. The whole thing went pear-shaped. I need to save my life or somebody else's.
Right.
That's what this is for. And at the end of that 16 hours, man, we'll do weapons manipulation qualification for time. We'll do a time and distance and accuracy qualification, and our standards are high enough that you can go past any other qual in the country. You want to go to FLETC and shoot, you're going to be able to run through that law enforcement qual, based on what we told you in terms of time and accuracy and distance, and you're going to be just fine.
Yeah. And I had seen some interesting stats on this that I wish I could recall, but I'll butcher it, of like, if somebody does have to present a firearm in a self-defense situation, it's like, it's over in this many seconds within this many feet with like this many rounds. And I just remember the numbers were staggering. It's like the average self-defense, shot is, 4 feet, 8 rounds happens in 2 seconds or some crazy shit like that. I'm sure I got the stats wrong, but it's like, you see on TV, you see in the movies, it's like these long shots, and it's, target practice, and it's the stuff that the movies have made us believe happen. What are you guys training for that actually happens in real life? Or maybe you even have a student that's gone through who unfortunately has had to present a firearm in a self-defense situation. Like what actually goes down when a firearm needs to be presented?
Yeah, well, statistically, self-defense shootings do happen at close range. Statistically, inside 20 feet, which is where the 21-foot rule comes from. Now, the 21-foot rule is a good rule of thumb, but I consistently teach people to fire accurately at less than that distance. But yeah, I mean, that period of time, it all happens inside 2-3 seconds. And yeah, 2 seconds in a gunfight is a lifetime. I mean, quite literally for somebody.
Yeah.
So, obviously, yes, you need to be able to apply that skill quicker, based on nearer proximity. The further away you are, you got a little more time to work.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all, and this is all supported by Department of Justice and FBI and Homeland Statistics. It's all inside 20 feet. It's all close range.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, I mean, this is not a duel, right? I mean, you don't get a lot of warning. And if you're responsible about it and you're taking the proper steps, you do have to compliance test a little bit. I mean, you can't just go waving the damn gun around.
Right.
That's not responsible. It's not legal. It's not any of those things. And so, it's not like you have an awful lot of warning to act. And quite frankly, smart criminals, if that's what you're dealing with, aren't going to give you a lot of time. They're going to get up close and personal to where they've got the best opportunity in their mind to actually perpetrate that crime. Because they're not getting into these situations to get shot. Believe it or not, that's not the motivation.
Yeah.
Because from what I hear, getting shot sucks.
Right.
So, I get it.
Never experienced it. Yeah. And there are thousands of tragic deaths every year for certain, whether it's the things that pull at our heartstrings, like a school shooting or an accidental death or something of that nature. But I've looked up these stats multiple times and kind of parsed them out. And it's like, all right, so the CDC or the Justice Department will say there's 40,000 gun deaths in America. Well, 24,000 of those are suicides. And I've had friends kill themselves, unfortunately, with pills and hanging themselves and driving their cars off of cliffs. I don't know why I've had so many friends that have committed suicide. I guess I just attract broken people. But like, if you don't have access to a gun, you're going to find a way to kill yourself. So 24 of those 40,000-ish are suicides. And then you go into, police shootings, justified self-defense homicides, things of that nature. When you whittle down the numbers and maybe you take out gang violence, where it's like it's 100% confirmed gang on gang, you get down to like the tragic loss of lives or the actual murders. Somebody kills their ex-wife or their ex-wife's new boyfriend or something. You're somewhere around a few thousand gun deaths, which is sad, terrifying for a lot of people. But then if you look at the other side, how many times is a gun presented in order to stop a crime by a civilian? Or, some lady is getting followed home and is about to be a rape victim and she presents a firearm. Somebody's house is getting broken into and they hear that, that loading of a shotgun, which is the most unique sound probably in the world, and probably
it'll get your attention.
It'll get your attention and immediately scares off criminals. Like, do you have any idea how many times a gun is presented in a self-defense situation and either saves life, property, something like that? I mean, the Justice Department has to keep some numbers on this stuff.
Well, yeah. And so I don't have the numbers at hand. I know John Lott, who wrote a book a number of years ago, More Guns, Less Crime, just did a study, just compiled the statistics on that. John Lott, L-O-T-T.
All right, we'll have Chris look it up, see if we can find the new John Lott study on how often people use a gun in self-defense or to stop a crime.
Yeah, well, and so I mean, his stats were compelling, but the other piece of that is, you can't account for how do you prove a thing didn't happen?
Right.
And an awful lot of people, while they are never going to report it, prevent things without any fanfare. Right. The problem goes away. There's nothing to report. Right. And I don't really want to have to go tell the cops that I just pulled a gun, because I don't know what happens next. And I don't need a lawyer and I don't need the problem.
Yeah. Let's say hypothetically in the state of California for decades, you couldn't get a concealed permit. You couldn't get a concealed weapons permit in Los Angeles, although now that's been overturned by the state and the federal Supreme Court, which is awesome. But let's just say hypothetically you were a jeweler in downtown LA and you couldn't get a concealed carry permit, but maybe you chose to carry a gun anyway, and somebody's following you to your car and you pull it out and they take off. Nobody's going to report that because you don't want to tell the LAPD that you were breaking the first law of you weren't supposed to carry a gun. So there's probably hundreds of thousands of those instances.
Sure. And so the statistics are skewed right out the gate, right? They're light because you just don't have the data to work with. Now, the other thing is relative to the way that data is presented, like you were talking about in the first place. Okay, you've got x number of deaths. Okay, well, yes, that's a big category, and you can refine it from there. You can get granular with it and understand what those deaths actually constituted. I mean, that's done for emotional purposes. Mark Twain had a quote about, there are lies, there are damn lies, and there's statistics.
Right.
And so that's an example. That's an example of exactly that, right? I mean, this is one step beyond damn lies.
Right.
And it's presented just in a way to elicit an emotional response from people who haven't thought through, categorically how that bucket of deaths actually breaks down. And what the real ramifications of that are. Does that make it a gun problem? Well, no. I mean, they just had a mass murder across the border in Canada in Saskatchewan, right? Was there a gun involved? No, it was a mass knifing.
Yeah, we just read about that. It was like two guys that kind of went town from town. They stabbed and killed like 10 and stabbed another, really brutally injured another 25. Like, not cool.
And so, I mean, the simple point about that is just like suicide. Okay. If you don't have access to your tool of preference, you'll find another avenue. Well, the same is true of violent crime. Okay. If I don't have access to a gun, I'll find a bat. Right. Okay. And look, if I had to choose, if I got to go on the business end of a violent crime, I'd rather get shot than beat to death with a bat.
So this is a weird conversation. I had a buddy in the Army who probably shouldn't have been in the Army based on his historical record. Let's just say he had a lot of blacked out tattoos on his body that he had to get covered over before they let him come in the Army. And I remember one night we were drunk, we were talking, he's like, "Oh man, I so much rather get shot." And he like lifts up his shirt, he's like, "I've been stabbed here. I got a through and through bullet wound over here. The bullet wound burnt a little bit, but that stab, god damn, that hurt." He's like, "And everybody I know who didn't die, they much rather get shot than stabbed." And I'm like, this is the weirdest conversation I've ever had.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of gallows humor, right?
Right.
But look, nobody likes pain.
No.
And very few people have experience with gunshot wounds. Everybody's got experience cutting themselves.
Yeah.
Right. And so everybody knows, hey, that sucks. Right. That's a very emotional thing. Because you have firsthand experience of what that feels like. You've got an imagination of what being shot might be like. But it's a much more brutal crime with other implements.
Yeah.
And that may sound callous. It's not intended to be. It's just, me being as objective as I can be about a thing. Sure. I'm just a realist about it.
I want to talk just because, and I hate that my time is limited because I want this to be like a 5-hour conversation. So I might put you on a plane sometime out to Vegas. We'll stay here and film a 5-hour podcast over whiskey and cigars. But you mentioned something at the very beginning that like, hey, it's self-preservation. It kind of starts with, gun fundamentals, but the real goal, the end result are decentralized communities that can help each other out. That, I got my neighbor's back, my neighbor's got my back. Maybe at some level I'm growing the tomatoes, he's got the chickens, dude down there's got the beef. Tell us a little bit about what the end state of you training people towards a decentralized community. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Well, I'll tell you why first.
Okay.
Right now we have a very one-size-fits-all, top-down mandated solution for everything, right? And mandate became the term du jour during COVID. And for a period, not a very long one, but a period, there was some thinking at the top about, there's no, let's let New York be New York, let's let South Dakota be South Dakota. Let's let folks, a little closer to home figure out what the solutions are for this, because it's not really the federal government's role to decide how people live their lives. And then suddenly, there was all this leverage applied, on the corporate side and all driven from what appeared to be DC centric place, where we had this one size fits all solution. It doesn't matter what your situation is. It doesn't matter if you're surfing, 500 meters off the beach, you got to wear a mask, or you can't be there, or, whatever it is. And okay, I'm not near anyone else. I'm surrounded by nothing but fresh air and water. How at risk could I possibly be, or how much of a danger to anybody else could I possibly be? But we've got to deal with this one size fits all solution, right? That didn't make any sense whatsoever. and you can argue about the efficacy under certain conditions, but there are other conditions where it just didn't make sense. And I'm a firm believer that people are going to choose the things, that choose the way to live their life that makes the most sense for them and is most beneficial for them.
Yeah.
And I think we should let them make those choices, right? And I think that probably falls very, very in line with your philosophical thinking as a libertarian. But I'm very much a live and let live guy. I don't really care how Scott lives his life.
Right.
Right. And I don't care if Scott cares how I live my life. I'm not beholden to you, and you don't have to do the things that I do if they don't make you happy, and I don't have to do the things that you do if they don't make me happy. So as long as I'm not, if I'm not inhibiting your ability to live a free life, why should you care how I'm doing my thing, right?
Right.
And so, I want to promote that. I think that's where America started, right? That was the whole purpose between almost all the migration, for generations to the United States, was freedom to live my life, freedom to make a life, freedom to make a better life, not freedom to go have to deal with this one size fits all cookie cutter, doesn't make any goddamn sense, knee-jerk response to a thing. That's not what this is. And so for me, it's really about getting back to first principles. It's really about getting back to that prime number of 3: life,
right.
liberty, property.
I love that.
And so, that's what I believe in, man. And I think when we were adhering to that, when we were, honoring that as a country, it was a great place to be.
Yeah.
That's why people came here.
Yeah.
Was to take advantage of that.
It's funny. There was a few watershed moments during the 2-year craziness of COVID in LA that made me even more libertarian. And the very first one was, early on, maybe April or May. We didn't know what we were dealing with. My mother-in-law, who I've got the world's best mother-in-law. I feel for anybody who doesn't like their mother-in-law, because my mother-in-law is world class. And she lives for our children. It's her only 2 grandchildren. That's her whole life. And so, at the time, my son would have been 4 and my daughter was 2. And we didn't know what the hell was going on. We really didn't know, like, if we get the cold or the COVID, are we going to go over and kill grandma, right? So we went and talked to her and we're like, hey, man, like, it's probably a year out before they figure out this vaccine thing. We don't know what's going on. Maybe we should wear masks. Maybe we shouldn't, da-da-da-da. And she just looked us in the eye and she's like, I would rather die than not see my grandkids for 2 weeks. I mean, her words, right? And she meant it. Like, she really meant it. Like, it was almost a warning. Like, don't you dare keep my grandkids away for 2 weeks. Because I would rather die than lose 2 healthy weeks with my grandkids. And so from that moment forward, I was like, well, that's her decision. Who is the government to tell her yay or nay? Right. You can't see your grandkids, or you can't do this, or if you end up having to go in for elective surgery, nobody can come in and be by your side when you're in recovery. And it's like that kind of watershed. A bunch of those watershed moments happened to me where I'm just like, oh yeah, I think I've had it right since I was like 17 and decided to become a libertarian. But yeah, I really want to continue this conversation, Les. So I'm going to shoot you an email so we can find either some time to do a part 2 when we're not rushed for time, or I can have you out to Vegas, or we'll figure something out. But I always like to end with these 2 questions, something optimistic and something fun. First question: what's your favorite movie and why?
My favorite movie, man, I'm going to say Grosse Pointe Blank.
Oh, I love that movie. That's out of left field, man. Most people don't know that movie. So explain to people real quick, Grosse Pointe Blank, why that's your favorite movie.
Well, I mean, okay, so it's my year group, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
John Cusack, right, coming back.
Yeah. It was and so I grew up. My teen years, of course, were rich with John Hughes films, right?
Yes.
And to me, Grosse Pointe Blank is like the antidote to the John Hughes films.
Love
it. You've got 10 years after high school, right? When, a good portion of people who you went to high school with, have done what they were supposed to do. They stayed home. They got married, squeezed out a couple of kids, and, they just lived these horrible, horrible, desperate lives. And, you got this one outlier who decided, fuck it, man, I'm out of here. I'm going to go do my thing. And, I mean, it's just comical. You've got this professional killer who goes back home for his high school reunion. And I mean, he, bald-faced tells people, yeah, look, I'm a professional killer. And nobody takes him seriously, right?
Right, right. He's an assassin. Everybody's like, yeah, that's funny.
You get dental with that? Yeah.
Yeah.
So so yeah, no, I really did Grosse Pointe Blank.
All right, I love it, man. I'm gonna put that on my rewatch list because it's probably been a decade since I watched that. And then, we talked about a lot of scary stuff. Let's leave with some type of optimism. What's something you're looking forward to? I mean, it could be tomorrow, it could be in the future, it could be about you, it could be about the country. What's something you're looking forward to?
Yeah, man, I'm just really looking forward to this country getting back on track, man. I'm looking forward to America being, a place that people desire to be, and not having the government breathing down about everybody's neck, and having people be concerned about where their next meal is coming from, or how they pay their power bill, or any of that crap, man. I like people.
So do I.
And I want them to live happy, healthy lives, and I think that helps everybody when people are happy and healthy, not just the happy and healthy. So yeah, I mean, I'm very, very hopeful for what's in store, despite some indicators to the contrary. And yeah, we can get back there. We just have to do it a different way. We can't follow the trajectory that we're on.
That's awesome, man. Well, Les, I appreciate you being on, man. We're going to find an excuse to talk or get together for a training here in the near future.
Yeah, man. Let's do it.
Thank you.